How's it going, everybody? It's Young here, and welcome to a Death Stranding analysis. While Hideo Kojima did not show any new footage of the game at E3 2017, he did drop one hint, an image of what appears to be a logo of the Bridges organization that Guillermo del Toro's character is a member of. I'm going to analyze as much of it as possible and see what I can deduce from all this. Keep in mind though, because we still know so little about the game, I might be doing some reaching here and there, but as I always say, half the fun of a Hideo Kojima game is the speculation and theories leading up to its launch. So let's just have some fun. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive right into it. If there is one thing that the image conveys very clearly to me, it's the main theme of Death Stranding: connections. Each strand represents one connection, or a metaphorical bridge between two entities, and all of these connections that meet and intersect come together to form a network of connections that shapes itself into a web. You should try charting out your own relationships, your connections with family, friends, and acquaintances, people you have influenced in any way, as well as those people's connections, family of family, friends of friends, acquaintances of acquaintances, and so on. You will probably find yourself creating a chart that will look like a messy tangle of webs with strands that intersect and overlap each other, a web of connections that we could very well label as society itself. This is especially relevant in our modern day and age, in which the whole world is connected through the power of the internet. Hell, there's a reason why another name for the internet is the web. This actually reminds me of a game called Xenoblade Chronicles. The game has an entire system dedicated to building relationships by partaking side quests, and to keep track of all of the NPCs' relationships with you and with each other, you can bring up what's known as an affinity chart. As you can see, when it's all charted out, these intertwining strands of relationships form something akin to a web of connections. The next Xenoblade entry, Xenoblade Chronicles X, has an even bigger affinity chart, forming an even bigger web. And I imagine that if we charted out our own affinity charts in real life with us at the center of it, that web would look pretty insane. Similarly, perhaps the Bridges logo represents the relationships and connections we will make in the game as players, with the player being at the center of the web. Where things get really interesting with the Bridges logo is how there are these 5 strands that meet at the center and extend outwards beyond the web. Another way to look at it would be that these 5 strands are coming inwards from outside and merging at the center. What immediately jumps out at me is how the number 5 seems to be a recurring motif in Death Stranding. I've noticed that the game constantly presents the visual elements of 5 entities that converge to a centerpiece. In the first trailer, we are shown 5 monolithic figures hovering in the air that converge on Norman. In the second trailer, we are shown 5 entities, Mads Mikkelsen and his 4 minions, converging onto Guillermo and the baby. Even things like the handprints seen throughout both Death Stranding trailers seem to share this motif. 5 fingers that meet at the center, the palm. While I can't be 100% sure what this all means in the grand scheme of things, I can definitely say that this pattern of 5 things converging to a centerpiece has reoccurred far too often to be written off as mere coincidence, especially now with this image featuring 5 main strands that converge at the center of this web, as well as the web's star shape, with stars being 5 protruding triangles that converge at the center. I am also confident in assuming that the center of this web of connections represents the player, and in turn you could say that it also represents Norman, the player character of Death Stranding. Now, in this particular game, our connection to the player character will go beyond that of player and avatar. According to what Norman said in an interview, Kojima told him that players won't just play as him, they will be him.
He goes, and I go, playing me? And he goes, no, they'll be you.
From that point of view, assuming Norman is indeed the centerpiece of this web, I can only surmise that the 5 outreaching strands represent the 5 monolithic figures. Let's call these 5 special strands the monolithic strands for the purposes of this video. The way each monolithic strand encompasses so much of this web, and the way they act as its foundation, might speak for the monolithic figures' omnipotence. Perhaps one way to look at this is that these monolithic entities who are akin to gods or at least a more advanced form of life beyond humans have seeped their way into Norman's life, his relationships, his connections, or that they have plans in which Norman, and in turn us the players, reside at the center of. Another possibility that I can think of is that the 5 monolithic strands might be outreaching to other webs. I feel like with the way the outreaching strands fade as they reach the edge of the image, we might not be getting the full picture. What if one of these network of strands, or one web, represents one player's world, universe, or dimension? We know from the various equations engraved on Norman's necklace that Kojima does plan to play around with high-level physics concepts like advanced space travel, time travel, black holes, and the idea of multiple universes. So what if by showing us these 5 outreaching strands that fade as they reach the edges, Kojima's telling us that there is more beyond this one web? What if this is just one of many webs? What if you can zoom out and find an entire network of webs that intersect each other, with each web representing a player's world, and with all of these worlds being connected somehow, manifesting the theory of multiple worlds and dimensions? Think of it this way: on the most basic level, our universe is comprised of a network of subatomic particles that form atoms. A network of atoms then form molecules. A network of molecules forms substances that act as the building block of all matter, including things like cells. A network of cells form organisms. From there, all kinds of new networks arise, food chains and the like. And as organisms become more intelligent, a network of intelligent organisms form relationships and connections. A network of relationships and connections forms society. A network of society forms cultures and nations. A network of nations eventually forms what we interpret as the world. From there, a network of worlds or planets forms solar systems. A network of solar systems forms galaxies. A network of galaxies forms the universe. A network of universes forms... well, that's a concept that I can't quite wrap my head around. But you get my point. You can just keep zooming out. In a similar fashion, what if this bridge's logo only shows a network of strands that form a web? What if the outreaching 5 strands suggest that we can zoom out further to find a network of webs that forms the player base of Death Stranding, their own Death Stranding world or dimension that they're the centerpiece of? What if all of this somehow suggests that the game will feature a unique online system in which players' worlds and dimensions will somehow interact with each other? Now, I do find it oddly specific that there are only 5 outreaching strands in this image. I stated before that I believe that the center of the web represents Norman and the player, while the 5 outreaching strands represent the 5 monolithic figures. This has me thinking, what if the catalyst for interdimensional interactions between players and worlds is these monolithic figures? What if these are interdimensional beings that somehow make it possible to bridge 2 worlds, 2 dimensions? And the fact that there are only 5 monolithic figures in the first trailer might suggest a cap for how many players can interact with another player's dimension or game session at a time. Here's an even crazier thought. What if the 5 monolithic figures are actually other players? The thing about Death Stranding is that I don't expect interactions with other players and other worlds to be as simple as your typical co-op experience where you hop in and out of a game session. Kojima has expressed that he intends to do something unique with Death Stranding, to emphasize the rope over the stick in a multiplayer environment. And I would say that having players interact with each other from different planes of existence falls into that category. Perhaps players can visit other players' worlds from a higher dimension, with the world's host player being able to witness the visiting players in godlike monolithic form akin to what we saw in the first trailer. To what end, I have no clue. We know so little about the game that it's hard to get into specifics on how any of this will service gameplay. But it sounds just crazy and unique enough to be right up Kojima's alley. So in summary, my theory on the monolithic figures sees 3 possibilities. 1, they are advanced interdimensional beings who will act as the catalysts for interdimensional interaction between players. 2, They are the players themselves transcended into higher plane interdimensional beings who can then somehow appear in other people's games in this monolithic form. 3, there are some weird combination of both of these concepts. And I believe that these possibilities are represented in this web of connections where we see the player at the center, the surrounding strands that represent relationships, connections, and interactions within your world, and 5 outreaching monolithic strands that could represent interdimensional bridges for possible interactions with other webs, other worlds, other dimensions, and other players. I should also point out that assuming this theory is true, the way the monolithic strands directly make their way to the center of the web might suggest that when 2 webs are connected, it forms a bridge between 2 web centers, or between 2 Normans, or 2 players, which perhaps further symbolically highlights that Death Stranding will allow for tangible interdimensional interaction between players and their respective worlds. Holy shit, that was a mouthful. Alright, so that about sums up the thoughts that came to mind when it comes to high-level ideas for this logo. Now, I want to bring it down a couple notches and talk about what the logo represents in terms of Death Stranding's story and lore. We know that Bridges is an organization that is based in the United Cities of America. We know that Guillermo is a part of said organization, and judging by how Guillermo is dressed, it's probably safe to assume that this organization is well-funded and holds significant power and influence. Now, something else that this image reveals about Bridges is that it's most likely based in Washington, D.C., or more specifically, the Pentagon. If we zoom in towards the center, you may notice that there is a thickly highlighted pentagon shape that is clearly visible. And before you say I'm reaching on this one, check out Guillermo's pin. Notice how in the pin's logo, the strands of this web converge in a very specific location on the pin's map of America. If you cross-reference this point with a real-world map of the United States, you will see that the web strands are in fact converging in Washington, D.C., which is where the Pentagon resides. For the cherry on top, if you look at the Pentagon in real life from a bird's eye view, you may notice that within the inner walls, there is a smaller pentagonal building reserved for the Defense Legal Services Agency that is surrounded by roads which form lines very reminiscent to the strands within the Pentagon outline at the center of the Bridges logo. The similarities are pretty striking, as if to suggest that Bridges is a government agency of the United Cities of America that resides within a pseudo-historical version of the Pentagon, if it's even called that in Death Stranding. I would also say that from a bird's eye view, the Pentagon does have web-like patterns not too dissimilar from the Bridges logo web. I should also point out that the web in this image is shaped like a star, which is very symbolic of America as a whole. That's why Captain America wears a big-ass star on both his chest and his shield. Speaking of stars, another name for a star is pentagram. The shape is basically a pentagon with triangles placed on each of the 5 edges. This had me thinking, what if something else that the Bridges logo is hinting at with its star-shaped web is that in the world of Death Stranding, the Pentagon has been transformed and renamed to the Pentagram. We know that at some point in Death Stranding's lore, the United States of America changed its name to the United Cities of America, suggesting that a major reform happened at some point. What if part of that reform also involved restructuring the Pentagon, maybe adding triangle-shaped structures on each of the 5 edges and creating an edifice that looks more like a star than a pentagon, resulting in renaming it to the Pentagram? Perhaps that's why the Bridges logo shows a pentagon shape that is reminiscent to the inner walls of our real-world Pentagon encased within star-shaped walls. Finally, one last thing that caught my attention about the Bridges logo is how distorted and broken it looks. The star itself is skewed and imperfect in its shape, and the star as a whole looks a bit like shattered glass, as if to say that America's broken or that something is not right. So the logo could be further hinting that we are looking at a dystopian world, a dystopian America. Death Stranding's second trailer already shows a ravaged, dystopian version of France, so who's to say that America and other nations didn't suffer a similar fate? The root cause of such a downfall, hard to say at this point. All we know is that dead people and antiquated weapons of war are being risen from their graves, with beings like Matt's character seemingly being able to harness these necromantic supernatural powers. Are aliens responsible for all this, or were humans the root cause of their own undoing? These are all things that we'll have to wait until more information is revealed to find out. Alright, so to summarize this video, when it comes to high-level ideas, I believe the Bridges logo represents a network of strands that form a web of connections. The strands within the web represent connections that occur within the confines of each player's respective world, dimension, and game session, while the 5 outreaching strands represent connections that will occur outside of these confines, connections with other players' webs, worlds, and game sessions, which might somehow tie into a unique online system in which players, by using monolithic interdimensional beings as catalysts, or by becoming interdimensional beings themselves, will interact with each other in some way. Bringing it down to the story and lore ideas, I believe that the Bridges logo hints that the Bridges organization is based in Washington, D.C., more specifically the Pentagon. I also believe that after the United States of America became the United Cities of America, the Pentagon might have been renamed to the Pentagram after it was rebuilt and restructured to look like a star for whatever reason. The star shape of the image's web also has significance in that the star is very symbolic of America as a whole. Now, the distorted and shattered nature of the star might hint that America isn't what it once used to be. The once sprawling United States of America might have turned into a distorted and dystopian United Cities of America. So yeah, a lot of information to process, but there you go, that's it for my analysis. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. Also, if you enjoy my content, consider supporting me on Patreon, so we can remain independent from third-party sponsorship and corporate interference. And to be further updated on all things Death Stranding, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out!